Hello and welcome back to the History of Politics, brought to you by the University of Melbourne. I'm your host, Edie Sheehan, and today we will be discussing the interesting and very complex topic of how the modern democratic system came to be. The focus on today is the role that different class structures in the 17th and 18th centuries played in the process of democratization, focusing particularly on the resistance of the aristocracy to the introduction of democratic institutions. Joining us today are two gentlemen, Thomas Wayne and Edward Smirke, who witnessed firsthand the beginnings of democratization in France, England, and America in the late 18th century. They have kindly emerged from their graves to share with us the experience of what it was like living in the early stages of democratization. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you. It's great to be here. Yes. Good to be here. So if you don't mind, I'd like to jump straight into it with a few sort of generalized questions about how democracy came to be so globally popular. When did this start? Who even started it? And did it sustain its popularity through the entire process of democratization? Well, Edie, democracy could be defined as a global revolutionary movement, and I can see it has been attributed as so in the recent scholar you asked us to catch up on, such as Palmer's The Age of Democratic Revolution. As you know, however, democratization was not very popular among certain classes of people, the aristocracy in particular, as it threatened to overcome centuries of tradition and entrenched social values that governed societies. Why is that? What had such significant political value to the aristocracy that they were so unwilling to give up? Did all aristocratic societies resist democracy? Well, yes. Coming from an aristocratic background meant you had great influence over political decisions and were heavily involved in decision-making alongside the crown. The role of the aristocracy and their response to democratization did vary, though. If you take a comparative look at England, France, and America, you can see how different factors influenced the push for democratization and how that countered different reactions in each nation. Yes, it all came down basically to how much wealth there was, where that wealth came from, and how it was used. In England, the wealth of the aristocracy was generated independently from the crown through commercialized agriculture and the rectification of the peasant problem. In France, the aristocracy was formed largely by the crown through giving land titles to commoners, which meant lots of the French were feeling very entitled and privileged. In America, the aristocracy were in favour of the concept of democracy, with many becoming counter-revolutionaries in an attempt to control the liberty of the masses. They didn't want plebeian democracy. They wanted a government run by respected aristocrats, just without the king to tell them what to do. So, as you can see, the circumstances in which democracy would affect their aristocratic privileges was different for each country. Nonetheless, the push for democracy from the lower and middle classes was strong, and revolutions continued to develop, ultimately leading to the abolishment of these privileged positions the aristocracy held in society. So, was democracy and universal suffrage obtained after these democratic revolutions? Not exactly. Governmental reforms happened, yes, such as the establishment of the House of Commons in England, the Constitution in America, and after quite a bit of time had passed, France issued a parliament composed of a chamber of deputies, elected by the people, and a chamber of peers, elected by the king. But property requirements in England and America, and tax requirements in France, still determined who had the right to vote. That doesn't sound very democratic to me. This Barrington Moore fella, he agrees with me. In his book, he wrote that by eventually abolishing property and tax qualifications, it promoted universal suffrage, resulting in a fairer and more representative system of government. But was universal suffrage, as we understand it today, really the aim of democracy back then? The push for universal suffrage, as you understand it, was definitely there, I suppose. But it seemed such a vastly different and unthinkable concept that the only consideration was given to universal white male suffrage. So, white male suffrage then. The resistance to that was pretty uniform across England, France, and America? Yes, that was a common ground for the aristocracy in different nations. Many thought universal suffrage and the introduction of voting rights would not work effectively to ensure those in Parliament had the best interests of the nation at heart. I have here with me a document dating back to 1841 that outlines the correspondence between Charles William Wentworth Fitzwilliam, the 5th Earl Fitzwilliam, and J.G. Marshall. Yes. I'm sure I have met Mr. Fitzwilliam's acquaintance once or twice. He was quite a wealthy and prominent man, as I seem to recall. You recall correctly, sir. As an earl, Fitzwilliam held a high rank in the aristocratic society, and as shown in this letter, he was vocally opposed to the introduction of democracy. His argument was that by establishing the House of Commons, all the people in England had been effectively accounted for and satisfied politically, and to go even further and introduce universal suffrage would lead to an incompetent and inexperienced government. This was the view of quite a few aristocratic Englishmen, was it not? Yeah, one of my distant relatives, Edward Burke, wrote quite the influential novel regarding the outcomes of the French Revolution. He believed aristocratic men in Parliament were generally born into that role and had the experience of government through a continuation of tradition that was crucial for making informed decisions. The French Revolution and the product of that was deemed as radical by Burke, stating that commoners and lower class people simply did not possess the knowledge or experience to effectively run a state. In America also, aristocratic resistance to universal suffrage was rife. I'm sure you're familiar with Alex de Tocqueville's work. He definitely admired the concept of equality in America, but you can see he was greatly concerned about the dangers to liberty, particularly for the aristocratic society. Being an aristocratic man himself, though, it's quite obvious he would attempt to floor America's democratic system and oppose the introduction of such a system in France. Not only did Tocqueville recognize the aristocratic resistance in America, you can see it here in this newspaper, a review of Francis Gunn's most controversial novel. Francis Grant. Who was he? Yes. He was a German immigrant, as I recall, and a most prominent journalist in America. He was also heavily involved in politics and held an aristocratic position, but didn't have much of the same views as his wealthy peers. His 1839 book, Aristocracy in America, Grant saw democracy as having the power to abolish self-selected aristocrats and was in favor of its expansion through North and South America. He recognized the aristocratic society had a spirit of selfishness and conceit, and criticized the masses for voluntarily reducing itself to a state of the most odious social bondage. This newspaper gave him and his book quite a thorough bashing, so you can see how much of the aristocracy definitely didn't wish for white male suffrage to happen. So, even though the aristocracy as a collective across those three countries had much to lose from the introduction of democratization, the democratic revolutions mostly ended with the wealthy still possessing much of the power then? If the push for universal or white male suffrage was ongoing even after the eruption of civil violence and uprisings, then it is clear how unwilling those in power were to give themselves up to free elections. That seemed to be the general gist of things. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but thanks so much for joining us on the show. It was my honour. Aye, it's quite fascinating to see how the world has turned out since I took my leave from it. Aye, it is. Stay tuned next Wednesday as we will be discussing the history of malevolent dictators in the 20th century.